Yes, everyone, you know what time it is. It's your boy Jack here at the Irish Hotspur, here to deliver you that scout report that you need on Pedro Porro. If you do enjoy these sort of scout reports, these player profiles that breaks down everything that you need to know about the players that Tottenham Hotspur are looking at, as well as bringing in these January transfer windows, do hit that like button, everybody. But let's get straight into it, into what you need to know about Pedro Porro. He had 9 goal contributions last season, 5 goals and 4 assists. That is, he's already equaled that this season in all competitions with 2 goals and 7 assists. So he's already building off of what already maybe plenty considered a very good last season. He's 23 years of age, can play as a right wing back as well as a right mid. Basically, that would be a right mid in like a 4-4-2, I would imagine. 1.73 meters tall, 5 feet 8 inches, 45 million euros was the release clause, but we are going to structure it over around 2.5 years, paid over installments of around 3 to 4 installments, I think is the case, everybody. So let me repeat, we are not going to trigger the release clause outright. We're not paying 45 million up front. We're paying it over a period of 3 to 4 installments, maybe 2 to 3 installments over 2.5 year time period, everybody. If you needed to know any extra special details on this sort of one, I think the personal terms are already agreed. I think he's agreed a 5 year deal with Spurs, everybody, by the way, on personal terms. That was already agreed, I think, a few weeks ago. But Porro is actually being allowed to play, I think, in his cup final against the likes of Porto and the Taça de Portugal. That is part of the reason why it's kind of dragging its heels a little bit, is because Sporting want to use him in their game against the likes of Porto to win a cup in their cup final. And it does make sense because it could be a nice little send off for him before he heads off to Spurs. Maybe no bad blood in that sort of situation. Another reason why it's dragging a little bit behind is also because of Spurs' sell-on fee for the likes of Marcus Edwards. Marcus Edwards is included in this sort of Marcus Edwards sell-on fee is included in this sort of negotiation, and they want us to reduce, I think, the sell-on fee so that we don't make maybe as much coin out of the potential sale of Marcus Edwards for Sporting in the future. That's another part of this deal that maybe has been made it sort of drag its heels a little bit. Another element that's made it drag its heels a little bit is the likes of, I think, Sporting do want to find a replacement for Pedro Porro, and that replacement could be, I think, Tarek Lamptey, in fact, from Brighton. But it lets we can't exactly confirm that yet, but they are looking for replacements. That's part of the other reason why it's kind of maybe taking a bit long here for maybe it to finally, let's say, get over the line. But let's take a look at maybe his numbers and all that sort of stuff, and maybe what he sort of can bring to Tottenham Hotspur, and the things that you really need to know about what Pedro Porro does well and maybe what he doesn't do so well. To really break it down simply, I don't want to go too much into the numbers or like pick them out to kind of a individual in an individual way, excuse me. But these are categories that I think are really important to maybe what brings a good right wing back going forward. You're looking at his crossing ability. You're looking at his ability to set up teammates, which is the key passes. That's a measurement of pass that leads directly to a shot on goal. So basically, a really great way to set measure how you set up your teammates. Shot creating actions is a fancy way of looking at just sort of chances created, dribbles completed, how many times you skim past your man, and then shots total. I think a lot of those are kind of encompass what could make a good right wing back. And when you're looking at those percentiles there, the closer that is to 100, the better he ranks in comparison to other fullbacks across Europe. And when you see how high he ranks there, he's basically one of the best in Europe when it comes to all of these metrics, which just really shows as to why Spurs have taken a look at him. Because when it comes to maybe crossing, setting up for teammates, being able to create from these wide areas, these are things that I think Doherty as well as Emerson have really struggled with. Whereas someone like Pedro Porro absolutely thrives in and excels in fact. But these are his numbers from his Premier League. So these are numbers from his domestic league, and these are then comparing him to other fullbacks or wingbacks across Europe. And when you're looking at just his domestic league numbers, he is playing for a team like Sporting, where one of the better teams in the Premier League, and all will have also more of the ball than the rest of the teams, and also are just one of the better teams in general. So his numbers could be slightly inflated, let's say. And so then when you kind of bring him to the Champions League, where he's coming up against better opponents, but also in a way kind of actually going from maybe one of the better teams in his own league to now being one of the worst teams in this sort of competition. No disrespect to them, but they are a bit of an underdog, I think, in the Champions League. So his numbers do go down sort of considerably. So you do just have to sort of take it with a pinch of salt, right? Like, whereas when you first look at his numbers, you're like blown away. You're like, holy cow. But then when you maybe look at his numbers from last season in the Champions League, you do sort of see, like, when he's met up against better competition, some of these do go down a little bit. So it's just something to take a look at, just something to consider there. The one thing that is maybe still quite high is his crosses are still quite high, and he's still getting off a few shots as well. But he wasn't playing in a tough group, and he also was playing for a team that I think is, one of the more underdogs in the Champions League. So he's not going to get as many opportunities to create as he would maybe when he's playing in his own domestic league. When we actually look at him this season in the Champions League, so the numbers we looked at were from last season. This season, he is doing actually, I think, a bit better. He's getting even more crosses in now per 90. And also, as well, he's actually skinning past more players per 90 too. But it's still not really maybe the best sort of rankings of numbers. And so you do just kind of always want to look at maybe the whole picture here. Like, yes, he's absolutely brilliant when playing for a really good side, in Sporting, and has all the best sort of numbers that you're looking for. But then when he's matched up against better opponents, some of this does go down a bit. And, you do get kind of, drawn back, and, maybe you have to look at it with a bit more context. And I still think he's a terrific player. I still think that, he's exactly what we need over at Spurs in terms of that creative ability. But it is always good, I think, to just look at a different data sets, different numbers, let's say. We have to look at also, though, his defensive numbers. So, like we brought up before, I think he's plenty sound going forward. He don't need to dig too deep there. I think he really is absolutely sound going forward. Defensively wise, though, he's not exactly, let's say, totally convincing. He's not totally convincing, but he's not bad either. There's a bit of a rhetoric that maybe he's bad defensively. I don't think that's the case, because if you do look at his numbers just from this season, and if you were comparing his numbers to the rest of the fullbacks across Europe, you're like, whoa, he doesn't really look very good here. But there's an explanation, I think, for that. That explanation being is that when you are playing for a team like Sporting in the Primera Liga, like I said before, you're one of the better teams and you're going to have more of the ball. So if you have more of the ball and you're in possession more often than you're out of possession, why is it that you would have high defensive numbers? There's really actually there's no chance to have high defensive numbers because you're more often found with the ball than you are without the ball. So you aren't going to really get too many chances to sort of win the ball back or get stuck in or make interceptions or put pressures on or anything like that. You're actually going to be more required when you're playing for teams like that to create. And actually sort of explains maybe why he's so good for a team like Sporting, is because he's so brilliant at creating. And when he's playing for a team that have plenty of the ball and are going to ask him to try to create against tough defenses, he can do so. Whereas, then his team aren't going to really have to defend that much. So his defensive numbers are going to go, considerably down. So when I look at these defensive numbers here, I'm actually not going to read too much into them. I have them up on screen, but I'm not going to read too much into them, mostly because, like I said before, he's not being asked to defend very much because he's playing for a Sporting side, which are one of the better teams in the league. And so he's not going to have that many opportunities to make sort of defensive actions. Whereas when he goes into the Champions League, he's going to be coming up against better opponents. He's going to be coming up against better teams than Sporting, who will have more of the ball than Sporting, and he will be asked to put in, more defensive contributions and more of a defensive effort. This is where it gets a bit concerning, is because I do think his numbers from last season defensively were not all that great. They really weren't all that great. And the one that I would really pick out there, everybody, is the fact that his dribble pass numbers are not too good there. And then he's getting skin pass at least 2 times per 90 last season in the Champions League. So at least 2 times per game, there was a moment where a player just completely skins past him and was able to just blow by him and to be able to create whatever chance from there. And so when you're having that happen, I do think that does show that maybe he wasn't very good in the one-on-one situations when coming up against good wingers or coming up against good opponents, because he was getting skin past 2 times. And if you compared that to other fullbacks in the Champions League, he was basically one of the worst when it came to that metric. He was getting skin past more than other fullbacks were in the Champions League. So that could also be because he was being put under a lot of pressure. Like I said, he was in a tough Champions League group, and he was also in a group where he's going to have to be involved more defensively, and he's coming up against better opponents. But he still didn't make a good case for himself, I think, in the one-on-one situation. So a bit concerning to see that you skim past 2 times per 90, but this is where you sort of caveat it. And this is where maybe you're left more confused or you're left a bit hopeful. I think it's one of the two. You're either left confused or you're left hopeful here. His numbers considerably improved this season from last season in the Champions League. So again, we're just using his numbers from the Champions League here, like just the Champions League games. So his numbers improved so much that I am left a little bewildered. Whereas maybe he isn't naturally a terrific defender. Maybe naturally his best attributes have always been going forward, being an attack minded player, crossing from deep, being able to create for others. That's where he excels. That is his bread and butter. And maybe it's more the defensive side of the game he's had to slowly kind of improve over time. And it does maybe show that he is, because he's improved dramatically on the defensive numbers he had last season. He has more tackles won per 90. He's actually tackling more dribblers in the one-on-one situations. The really big one that I point out again is that last season in the Champions League, he's getting dribbled past 2 times per 90. This season in the Champions League, he was only getting dribble past close to around once per 2 games. So, like, not even getting dribble past once per 90, getting dribble past once every 2 games. So, it does show that he made a huge contribution, or at least improved a lot there. His tackles, interceptions, I think, did a lot better, and his blocks were a lot higher. So, it was actually one of the better defenders, really, in the Champions League with these numbers. Sincerely, one of the better defenders in general. And so, it's confusing because you look at his Champions League numbers from last season defensively, not all that great. And you look at his defensive numbers from this season in the Premier League, where he doesn't get that many opportunities to defend. His defensive numbers don't look all that great. But then when you look at him in the Champions League from this season, his defensive numbers look fantastic. And so, like I said, you can't exactly call him a bad defender. That's all I would say. I'm not sure if I can call him a great defender, but I don't think I can call him a bad defender either, because his numbers have improved a lot. They have improved a lot from this season. And it does show that maybe he's not exactly useless defensively. If we were to compare him to somebody that we do consider an okay defender, at least some people probably consider him better than an okay defender. But if you were to compare him to Emerson from the Champions League, because Emerson did play the most Champions League minutes of any of our right wing backs, Pedro Porro actually did a lot better than him defensively. And I actually rate Emerson defensively for the most part. And the fact that Pedro Porro was actually looking even more involved, even more active than Emerson was, because Emerson's very aggressive as well defensively. But Pedro Porro looked even more aggressive, looked even more active than Emerson was. So I do find that impressive. The one thing that maybe Emerson was better than him at was sort of aerial duels and aerial win percentages. But I think that's not a surprise, considering Emerson is quite tall, quite athletic, but also Pedro Porro's not really very tall or not very athletic. So it probably is something that he's always going to struggle with, are those aerial duels. If we look at the numbers going forward, he's absolutely going to destroy Emerson. One of the ones that you can really see he destroyed him in there was the crosses, and then as well is the dribbles completed. Emerson's on 0.23 per 90, whereas Pedro Porro is on 1.61. So he's actually skinning past 1.5 men per game, whereas Emerson takes about 5 games, it looks like, to skin past one player by the looks of things. So that's a bit of context about how you would look at that. If you were to actually compare him to Doherty from last season, the reason I've taken Doherty's numbers from last season in the Premier League is because I think that is the best version that we've seen of Matt Doherty, and that's where his best numbers came from. We're looking at the defensive numbers here. Matt Doherty is actually better than Pedro Porro, and I think, again, that sort of follows in line with the sort of numbers that I explained from earlier, is that if you take Porro's numbers, his domestic league numbers from the Premier League, his defensive numbers are not going to be all that high, because he has much more, he's being asked to do more with the ball than he is without the ball. So if he's more responsible for things creatively with going forward than he is actually defensively, his defensive numbers are not going to be all that high. Whereas Doherty, I think, had probably more chances to get stuck in, was playing for a defensive side like Spurs, but also is just playing in the Premier League, where he's coming up against good opponents and will be asked to do more defensively than maybe Pedro Porro was asked for his respective side of Sporting here. So it is, again, interesting to compare it to, the current Spurs players. But when you, again, use his numbers going forward, when you use those creative numbers going forward, he absolutely smacks the competition here. I mean, he's just so much better than the likes of Doherty and Emerson. He's completing way more crosses, way more key passes. He's more creative. He's skinning past more players, and he's firing up more shots as well. Pedro Porro simply is just so much better than the two going forward. Defensively, though, it is interesting. Like, is he better than them defensively? I'd like to think maybe not. I'm probably better than Doherty defensively, but maybe not Emerson. In the Champions League this season, though, he looked to be at least numbers wise better than Emerson. But I have heard from people before that he's not exactly the most convincing defensively, Pedro Porro. It is something he still needs working on. There's a guy named Martin Walton who watches plenty of Sporting over in Portugal, who is a Spurs fan and who really likes Pedro Porro, but has said he's always had his, like, maybe his, he has his doubts when it comes to his defensive ability as well as his physicality. So that's what I would say is something you would bring up. So if you were to look at any weaknesses of Pedro Porro, it would be those aerial duels, and it would be that sort of physicality. He's not very tall, he's not very strong, and so he is going to maybe struggle in that sort of department. And maybe if you were to sort of take his numbers from last season defensively in that Champions League, they were concerning. Like they were not great numbers at all. He made huge improvements, made huge strides from those numbers, but they still weren't great numbers to begin with. So you would look at maybe the one-on-one defending as also maybe a potential weakness. But the strengths, it's his crossing and his technical ability and just his striking the ball. He has a really, really dangerous cross. He can cross the ball early and he can cross the ball from deep. Those are two things that I would say Emerson and Doherty cannot do. They rarely cross the ball early and they rarely cross the ball from really deep positions. Pedro Porro can put in one of those delicious, like looping balls in nice and early. That's, high in the air for somebody to rise up and hit. You can also hit one that's low on the ground and early that like loops in. And so that someone can run onto and tap away. He can also play it on the floor, play it quite comfortably on the carpet. He can, put in a nice swinging ball in. He can do basically it all when it comes to the crossing department. He hits it with real intelligence. Like he knows where his players are. He picks them out. He picks up his head before he does it. He really is terrific in that department. And his technical ability, I think, is beyond the likes of Emerson and Doherty as well. And like I said, with that ability to be able to cross early as well as cross from deep, he can be far better in those wide areas than I think that the likes of Emerson and Doherty are. I think he's also just better at skinning his man than they are as well. I think he'll find it easier to sort of take it past them in the one-on-one situations, and also to just prove that he is a good striker of the ball and he is a good crosser of the ball. He actually takes set pieces and takes corners for them as well over at Sporting. So if they trust him to take set pieces and they trust him to take corners, you can tell that he's a good striker of the ball, but then you can also tell he probably has a pretty good cross on him. One little question that some people did maybe want to bring up is, can you play with Perisic and Porro with our very leaky defense? I'd like to think you can. I think it's already been a struggle to have, right wing backs that really do maybe produce very little going forward. Maybe they've been solid defensively from time to time, Doherty and Emerson, but they really have produced very little going forward. And that could actually relieve, I think, a lot of, pressure on Spurs from when we are sort of struggling to create. We now actually have a bit of balance where it's not just Perisic that's creating on the left. We now have someone like Pedro Porro who can create on the right. So I think that is something that absolutely is a plus and is a benefit. Yes, our defense could be put under further pressure, but also the opposition defense will be put under further pressure because now we actually have a right wing back that can really threaten them. And it'll be interesting to see, though, because is Pedro Porro good enough to track back? Is he good enough to get forward and pick his moments, but as well as get back and be able to get up and down? I think he can. But if he struggles with that, then we might have to consider, maybe playing Sessegnon more often instead of Perisic. That is something maybe worth looking at. Who's coming in or who's leaving if Pedro Porro does come in? It does look like Jed Spence is being made to go, maybe headed off to Bayer Leverkusen, Olympique Lyon, something like that, maybe another Premier League club or something, like a Brentford or whatever. But Jed Spence seems to be the one that's likely to go. Are we going to stick with 3 right wing backs for the rest of the season? I really hope not. I think I'd rather the rotation actually be personally between Emerson and Pedro Porro. If we do want to sell Emerson this window, I would absolutely just do Pedro Porro and Doherty. But if you really did want maybe like a defensive option versus maybe a more attacking option, I would keep Emerson and sell Doherty as well as Jed Spence. But the more likely one to actually head out this January window is Jed Spence. There it is, everybody. There is everything you need to know about Pedro Porro. And let's just do the details again. It is going to be paid over 3 to 4 installments, maybe 2 to 3 installments over 2.5 years, 45 million euros, everybody. And then there's some other special details that I mentioned in the beginning that you should probably take a look at. But hit that like button on your way out, everybody. If you do enjoy these scout reports, if you do enjoy these player profiles and everything that you need to know about the signings that are coming to Tottenham Hotspur, I'll leave you there now, everybody. As always, come on, you Spurs, and in Conte I trust.